Hi, this is Alex Bryant. Thank you very much for participating and registering for today's webinar, which will focus on the global supply chain and manufacturing footprint strategy with all the developments and the changes and the uncertainty what's going on in China. A lot of the work we're seeing on the ground that we're performing in Mexico and Southeast Asia and Central Eastern Europe is driven by a need, a desire to lower diversification beyond just China, without being so dependent on China. So we thought today would be a good example to talk about some of the companies that how they reduce their own footprint, their supply chain manufacturing footprint strategy in China, and how they executed that. So wanted to first, on a brief introduction of East West, on a housekeeping note, you all have see a control panel on the upper right hand side. You'll see an orange box there. If the arrow is pointing left, you click it, open up the control panel, and there is a section there for questions. Please feel free to ask questions. We'll be taking questions throughout the entire presentation. We've got a lot of knowledge on the phone today, so please feel free to ask questions. Obviously, all of them remain anonymous. So please, but feel free to ask questions as going through this. We're going to have a brief introduction of East West. We're then going to discuss, show you briefly the upcoming webinar series we have going forward, brief introduction of the speakers and the current supply chain, and then we're going to get into the case studies and the Q&A discussion, and then the follow-up questions. Okay, first on East West Associates, very briefly, we started in 2005. We operate on the ground in 5 markets: the U.S., China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe. All the people at East West have really one requirement, one responsibility, and that is they have, prior to joining East West, they all had to have P&L responsibilities for running a Western multinational on the ground in these 5 different markets: China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Eastern Europe, and the U.S. And East West gets heavily focused. Our focus primarily is on global supply chain and manufacturing footprint. And underneath that will come everything from supply chain, identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, supplier transition, supplier audits, everything from closing factories, moving factories, relocating factories on the operational side, all aspects of human resources, hiring employees, training of employees, and then on the risk management implementation, we have a group of ex-policemen, ex-military in our different markets to do quite a bit of background checks for us. In China, we're doing a lot of training, labor training, training of the labor force on Chinese anti-bribery. So that's a little bit about what our core practice is. Our extensive experience in multiple different industries, you can see them listed on the page. And here are the 5 markets we talked about that East West operates. Okay, briefly on the webinar series we have coming forward, these will be the next 5, or among the next 5 webinars we have coming up around Mexico supply trends. We've been operating there I've been there since '95. So there's huge changes going on in Mexico now, even in the last 3 years. Vietnam, the development of the supply chain base there and the manufacturing. We'll do one on electronic sourcing, specifically the electronic sector, about sourcing in China and Southeast Asia, because that is a lot of developments, in particular in Southeast Asia, in the electronics industry. We're talking about senior executive hiring and background checks in post-COVID China, because that market has changed, and how you're going after those employees and those candidates. And then finally, looking at relocation manufacturing operations within China, primarily for clients that have plants on the ground in China, operations in China, and they are affected by urban sprawl. Are they being encouraged, strongly encouraged by the labor union, by the business park to move to another area? So now we'll a brief discussion on the introduction of the speakers. Let me introduce Mark Plum and Dan McLeod. Mark, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. Yes, my name is Mark Plum, and pretty much spent most of my adult working career overseas, as starting out in Thailand in the early 90s, and then moving to Shanghai, and eventually becoming the president of Briggs & Stratton with the responsibility of 4 or 5, 6 manufacturing facilities throughout Asia. I come at things from a kind of a business development, product development, general management approach, and then subsequently, based on that, have we've expanded out into, of course, Mexico, and then of course Central and Eastern Europe over the last 5 or 10 years. So a lot of experience overseas.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I'm Dan McLeod. Come from a engineering and factory management background. So in the late 90s, like many folks that went to China, went to oversee construction and staffing and startup of facility, and eventually stayed in Asia for 21 years, about 13 years total in China, 7 in Southeast Asia, based in Singapore, but covering the region, and also a year running a factory in the Philippines. Background primarily in the chemical industry, but also some experience in food and pharmaceutical additives and a little bit of electrical equipment manufacturing. Been working with East West for the past 5 years now, and in addition to projects in China and Asia, also in Central and Eastern Europe and Mexico.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Okay, so now we will have a brief discussion on the current situation, the current global supply chain distribution situation. Just briefly, kind of 8 points that we all have experienced over the last 3 to 5 years. Obviously, the cost of inflation going up, the effect in China, the labor costs are rising, the logistics situation. We are noticing companies are continuing to switch to more of a nearshoring strategy and away from dependence on China. I think we obviously all have been seeing that. It's really being driven by closest to the end consumption. These trends are less relevant to those companies who, with operations in China, for China, who sell in the China market. These are much more applicable to companies who are operating on the ground in China facilities and are relocating them outside or sourcing out of China for components or raw materials and relocating them. On the geopolitical issues, that's obviously making it, that's in a tougher spot than it has been between the tension between the U.S. and China, and that's now entering into discussions that we're having with boards or executives about, and it's making life more challenging as they're making investment decisions going forward. Okay, so for right now, we'll get into really the Q&A discussion here. We're going to present 3 case studies as we talked about on the introduction. All 3 case studies will be diversifying from China to Mexico, then to Poland, Czech Republic, and to Thailand. The first one on the Mexico side, the customer base in this case is in the U.S. and North America. The second one around Czech Republic, and the customer base there was in Eastern Europe and, Western Europe. And in Thailand, in that case, the primary customer base was in Southeast Asia, although they did supply some in China. So these 3 case studies we'll review and ask questions as we're going forward. You'll see that on the control box. And literally, these are all really driven by closeness and proximity to the customer base and the need to diversify outside of China. So I'm now turn it over to Mark Plum. Mark, if you would take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yeah, this is kind of a template that we work ourselves through, and then from this template, then it really leads us to where the countries are. And as Alex said, where's your market? I mean, where's your components and finished goods? Where will they be consumed? The days of long supply chains have really been problematic, as we all know. And so location and trying to produce where and near you sell has become really important. Once you kind of know that, then you have to be sure, well, do you have the raw materials and components in those areas that you think are near to where you want to go? And I mean, it sounds kind of basic, but this is critical. And sometimes people forget this, that if you don't have the raw materials and components, to either buy or to put into your manufacturing process to supply your nearby markets, that's pretty critical. And then where we all think about labor, and people focus sometimes, I think, a little bit too much on labor costs. 2 other things that I think get overlooked sometimes, it's your availability of labor, and we'll talk about that a little bit in Mexico now as we go forward because of the big surge of people down there, and the skill set. So obviously you have to have competitive labor rates, but you have to have available labor. and they have to be able to do the job that you're asking them to do. So once you've kind of decided, okay, I want to be in this area, and in this area, I have the components and raw materials. I also have the labor. Then you have to decide, okay, if you decide which area, which country, for example, within which region, which state, which site is most attractive. And this is really a lot of times around government support. And then areas you have to consider is, do you want to purchase land and build to suit? Do you want to lease an existing facility? Do you want to build into suit and lease back? Or do you just want to source components and bring back to your USA manufacturing base? So when considering locations, you really need to review the business climate. Do they want your business, particularly if you're making investments there? What's the incentives that may or may not be available? What's the transparency and ease to set up a business or sourcing? And of course, anything to do with corruption concerns, the corruption index, things of that nature. So just a quick recap: where are you selling? Do you have the raw materials and labor nearby? And once you agree on that, can you find a country where the government support really fits what you're trying to do? So we're going to have, again, three case studies, and then one's, of course, for Mexico, and then, of course, and then something for Central Eastern Europe, and then, of course, something for the Far East. So I'll turn this over to Dan now to talk a little bit about Mexico.
Hey, thanks, Mark. This was a client, was a U.S.-based manufacturer of electronic equipment selling into industrial markets, and very successful, and had been established in China since the early 2000s. They had a strong operation with a strong domestic market, had grown steadily at that time, so very satisfied with the performance of that operation. In addition to manufacturing, they had developed a sourcing office there, and they were sourcing components for the U.S. factories. So we were engaged by them to initiate a search for suppliers in Mexico, and their drivers were tariffs, the introduction of tariffs a few years ago, and then subsequent to that, the logistics challenges, the cost, the increased transit times, or the container availability, certainly all the cost and uncertainty that we struggled through 1 to 2 years ago. Became increasingly concerned about the political situation, and this was a few years ago, and they were really looking forward into the future on that, and could see a direction, and had some concerns, particularly where their marketplace was somewhat of a high-tech products, and they were concerned about China 2025 policies and potential for loss of intellectual property and loss of control of production. Next slide, please.
Dan, we had 2 questions pop up. One, here in this case, they're obviously looking for electronic products. Obviously, you're getting into the supply in the domestic market, and they wanted to initiate search in Mexico. They were at the question that popped up here was, when you're looking into Mexico, what was the experience of working with Mexican suppliers? And the question here simply remarks: is there a change in Mexico since post-COVID as far as dealing with Mexican suppliers?
Probably the biggest change is that there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of interest. Suppliers are fielding many more requests than they were 5 or 10 years ago. And it's stressing capacity, but also stressing their capacity to respond. And so having relationships with suppliers are key to getting their attention, or being able to develop those relationships. The ability to get pricing and technical information, capability information back from suppliers is becoming increasingly more difficult and time consuming. And so the importance of having knowing these folks and having local people to facilitate that is increasingly important. So, the project was, we chose one large commodity. It would have to be metal stampings, and we did that for a couple of reasons. It was a well-established supplier base in northeast Mexico, the Monterrey Saltillo area, that we were quite familiar with. And when you looked at their SKUs, the parts they were producing, it was a pretty strong 80-20 distribution. So we could focus on the significant many and for looking to relocate the supplier base. We identified potential manufacturers. This was a team in Mexico that had a good list, a good understanding of the supplier base. We qualified them based on interviews and site visits, and also reputation and prior knowledge. Developed and issued RFQs on behalf of the client, working with their technical people. And got the responses back, tabulated, evaluated, and worked with the client to choose and whittle down to a short list of folks to visit. And at that point, coordinating the visits to the top candidates, supported negotiations, particularly around freight and logistics, standard terms and conditions, trade compliance issues, and helped to maneuver in that space. And following that, supported supplier transition, which would include attending quality audits, following up on quality audits, trial runs, for example, were attended and were the eyes and ears on the ground at the suppliers for those. And then once the product was accepted, started working on a forecasting, scheduling, material planning systems between the client and the supplier to get the business off and running as they ramped up. So successful undertaking the last couple of years on that.
Dan, I got a couple of questions that come from, one was, what other products did you do besides metal stampings? This is from a company that says fabrication business.
Yeah, okay, we get quite a few requests for castings, and that's on multiple metals, whether it's aluminum or ductile iron, stainless steel, brass in some cases. Machine shop, machining of castings and components, sometimes used with the casting supplier, sometimes separate. A lot of metal stamping, as I mentioned in this particular case. Coating, enameling, surface treatment suppliers. We've done a fair amount of investigation on that, and then electrical, mechanical assembly and box building, which is a big piece of the manufacturing economy and a good fit for Mexico.
Yeah, and I know we've also tackled some automotive, and we're in the process of medical.
Yeah.
But the question also goes on, says, what products you found not applicable in Mexico? This company is sourcing out of China currently.
I guess probably the one that comes to mind the first is basic electronic components. Still manufacturing still heavily centered in China and to some extent Southeast Asia. Really, you're going to be, if you need electrical components or build for your build, you're likely going to be importing a significant percentage of those going forward. The manufacturing base isn't established. That's big one.
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
No, that's it, Alex.
Another person has come up, they've got a facility in China looking at Mexico, and their comment is Mexico more of a labor play because the costs they've looked at have been expensive in Mexico?
Labor and in many cases tariffs are the two drivers. You've got land, building costs, utility costs, and material costs are not substantially less than what you'd find in Asia or the US, certainly. So it's really around labor and tariffs, the big drivers.
And the last question we had on Mexico, which was, a company said it's a U.S. manufacturer, doesn't indicate what industry, but says they're looking at establishing distribution centers in Mexico or the U.S. I assume that in the sourcing obviously out of Mexico. Can you talk about the experience on either one?
We've generally looked at distribution centers on the U.S. side. That's more of a common move. Quite a bit of growth in the border, particularly around Laredo, we've seen recently, and in other Texas border cities. Again, it's growing rapidly, and a lot more interest in it. But one of the things certainly that companies have seen by moving to Mexico is that it can reduce the number of distribution centers they find themselves operating in North America, because they've shortened their supply times by getting closer to the market, and so they can get faster response time and reduce the number of distribution centers and the inventory holdings.
Has the final questions popped up on Mexico? This is from a supplier to the automotive sector. Have found that question was, are the Mexican suppliers or suppliers in Southeast Asia as efficient as the Chinese suppliers? And I guess efficient meaning as far as the compatibility can produce as quickly and rapidly as the Chinese suppliers are.
Yeah. This is Mark. I think that's kind of it depends, right? A little bit. So Southeast Asia on electronics is very efficient, right? The automation is very similar to what goes on in China. Mexico, as Dan said, might be a little bit different based on labor content and things of that nature.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Those are the questions that popped up on that case study. So now we're turned to the second case study, which is around establishing the supply chain manufacturing in Czech Republic. Mark, I will turn that over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, we're going to go through two more case studies, and they're a little more progressive as in terms of your investment in your how many chips you're putting down in new markets and in new countries. The first one, of course, was really more for a component supply, sourcing, et cetera, et cetera. This one we're going to talk more about it, like we talked about before, moving closer to your markets. And in this case, it's a USA global HVAC business it was in Jiangsu province going back actually 25 years now. And like a lot of people back then, 25 years ago, they were able to go from the US to China and reduce their bill of material cost or their total cost anywhere between 25 and 30%. What they were producing in China then went to a lot of areas, but a third of it then went to Europe. And at that time, when you were reducing your costs by 30% and your container costs to Europe were about $1,800, and you had pretty decent loads in your 40-foot high cubes, freight costs were really were pretty insignificant. So what happens, by 2019, the labor costs, of course, had been gradually moving up in China. Shipping cost has increased, not to the point of where they were a few years ago, back to the States. But more importantly, the business environment was getting more difficult in China. And then by shipping having such long lead times, 9, 10, 11 weeks on the water, port clearances, et cetera, they set up 4 or 5 distribution centers throughout Europe to be closer to some of their consumers in Italy, in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries. So given all that, the client asked us, they said, hey guys, can you help us take a look where we should put a new facility in to take this load off of China and move it closer? So, and we, everyone looks at Europe, of course, and Europe, early on, we knew right away, and we've known that for years, that you wouldn't want to, on this kind of product, the labor costs would have been prohibitive. So we looked pretty much at Central Europe. And then we looked specifically at the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. And we talked about things you look for. You look about proximity to markets, labor costs, labor skill set, availability of raw materials and components. And the Czech Republic and Poland were very, very close. And actually, in the area, we ended up choosing the Czech Republic, but frankly, it was really right on the Polish-Czech border. And if people remember, so much of that area was for 30 years ago, for the when USSR was, a lot of manufacturing went on in that area to feed back to Russia, so to speak. So we had a good area there, right along the border. It was 10 hours. The EU has really, in the last 20 years, put a lot of good interstate or inter-country highway systems from Poland and from Czech Republic back into Western Europe. So as I said, we had a solid metal fabricating, and labor rates were competitive and available. So, I mean, yeah, in this case, our labor rates aren't less than China at this point, but when you take into consideration 9-10 weeks on the water, custom port clearances, additional distribution centers, because you got to have product there, it really worked out well from that area. So then when we began to focus on the Czech Republic, Ostrava, which we've done some bit work with before, and the city of Ostrava, and what they call Czech Invest, which is the government incentive board, really attracted us. I mean, they wanted our business a lot, and for the fact we had an iconic brand name. So land became almost a non-entity because it was so inexpensive, and then a package of incentives to really help train our employees. So again, we said, okay, this is where we want to be. In this case, our client didn't really want to own, so we worked closely with them, found large developers who were able to the developer bought the land. They were able to build to suit a facility to their standards, and this was important because it's not just a box. In this case of this manufacturer, you have air control and heat control and air and the quality of the air and the particulates. So a lot of went into the HVAC within the facility to build this product, to build HVAC. And then we ended up building a 700,000 square foot facility, 680 employees, and it's been up and running now for about 2 years. And as I said, it's worked out well, and it's 10 hours to Berlin, not 10 days from Guangdong province. So in this case, built a new facility, but we use a developer and we help manage that process. Next slide, please, Alex.
Mark, we had a couple of questions pop up. One, talk about the suppliers that you find in Czech Republic and Poland. What kind of suppliers are you finding there? What is it? Is that part of region of Central Eastern Europe a good supply chain base?
Yeah. As we talked about a little bit, metal fabrication is extremely good. Remember, that used to be an armament area, when it was all part of the Soviet sphere. So a lot of people really understand, working with metals, bending metals, heavy construction, so to speak. And a good work ethic. I mean, it's just, it's a strong middle class work ethic, and as I said, around the metal fabrication. Automobile is now taken off because they used to be in the armament business with tanks and things of that nature. So, and what goes to an auto, of course, is metal fabrication, etc. So that's really quite good there in Poland and in Czech Republic specifically.
Is there anything was this person's asked as far as sourcing, availability of electronic sourcing?
Oh, some, sure, because remember, the auto industry is so large, right? And as you start, getting into the automobile industry and you start localizing, then you get into the PCB boards and basic chips and that sort of stuff. So yes, of course.
Second question came up. A company that's got a plant in China asking cultural differences between operating on the ground in China versus operating on the ground in Poland, Czech Republic? I think the cultural difference is what they were asking.
It's funny. I first went to China in 92 or 3, right? And where your work ethic was really strong, and you could hire people and train them, and they would work really, really hard for you. And that's changed over the years, I think, somewhat now because of the affluency in China. What we have found, and what I have found specifically in both Poland and Czech Republic, is a little bit like that was in China, 20, 30 years ago. These people there in those countries have not had a lot over the last 20 years, right? So the work ethic is really strong. The family knit is quite strong. Work extra hours is quite strong. So yeah, no, I would kind of compare it to how China was when I first went there 25, 30 years ago.
Okay. Next question that popped up was talk about the labor pool, and essentially the question was specifically what's the availability of labor and the quality of labor. This from a company that's got plants on the ground in the U.S. and in China.
Well, as I was saying, yeah, the quality of labor is quite high, because they've been and I'm speaking more specifically around the metal fab, the industrial, the automotive base, right? Whether it's automotives, whether it's appliances, whether it's HVAC, there's a lot of commonality, so it's quite high. Probably the only thing that's become a little more problematic, and Dan touched on it a little bit down in Mexico, is availability. As China has going through some of its issues and geopolitical, and people like some of our audience here are deciding to go to Mexico or Central Eastern Europe, there's more demand. So that's why when we negotiated this with Czech Invest, which is in the case of Czech Republic, excuse me, there's an overarching government for the whole country for investment, and to attract investment, and then specifically certain regions then will add to it. So that's why the employee training and the incentives for the employee training was very good. So yeah, you have to plan for that, and you have to make sure you have maybe technical schools nearby and the support of the government.
Last question that popped up on this case study was, did you close a factory for this? In other words, did they end up closing the one in Jiangsu?
They had 2 factories, so we closed one, and one is still there. Yes.
Okay. Given the fact that given that fact, can you talk a little bit about what managing shutdowns in China if they had to close one of the factories?
Yeah. Well, this one, and this is specifically important because if you have 2 facilities and you do something wrong, and you get on the wrong side of the government, it can affect the facility you want to keep open, right? So there's the physical piece, that's the building, the lease, the equipment, the disposition. You got to work on all that, of course. But then there's the softer sides. It's the employees. How many do you have? How long have they been working for you? What's the severance package? What's the severance package in the regions around you? Okay, that's all really critical. And then the last one, and people forget a lot of times, and the longer term one is closing out the books as it pertains to the tax bureaus and the labor bureaus, to make sure your VATs and all your taxes and everything are all squared up with the different bureaus. And as I said, and if you're interwound a little bit with another facility, that can become a little more problematic. But having people on the ground working in China with Chinese, working with the Chinese authorities, we've done a lot of these now, so I wouldn't call it a template, but there's a way to do it and do it right. And so if you decide to have another facility there, it doesn't hurt. You don't have any ill effects. And if you decide I'm going to leave, but then I want to come back in 10 years or 5 years, you've left in good standing.
Dad, would you add anything to that?
One of the things that we stress is the need for planning, upfront planning. We normally like to take at least a 2-month period to develop a plan, work with the client's management and local leadership to develop very solid plans around understanding required severance, understanding market practices around severance, having communication plans, um, inventory disposition, whether you need to build up or draw down inventory. So the need for a multifunctional, cross-functional planning is key, and something that we emphasize all the time with folks.
Yeah. Yeah, Dan brings up a good point. We talked about a little bit earlier about inventory and inventory planning. You decide you're going to close a facility and you're going to open a facility somewhere else. You could have 18 months, 2 years, and you need to be able to bridge yourself so you can seamlessly move from from one facility to another, and typically that's done with inventory. So you have to be able to really have a good timeline on not only closing, but then a good timeline on when you're going to start up again wherever you're moving to.
Excellent. All right. Mark, I think we'll now turn to the next. You worked out all those questions on that case study. So now we'll turn to the one about supply chain and manufacturing in Thailand.
Yeah, sure. So again, another manufacturer, large, very large actually, and pretty iconic in what they do. And so they were again, Guangdong province, and major, I say China, but most of their markets had really been growing into ASEAN. And in ASEAN, as we, people may know, it's 800 million people, high disposable purchasing power, young, in a lot of cases, a very young population. So and with free flow of goods within ASEAN and with ASEAN and China, it's quite a market, and for if you're in Asia. So a client of ours asked us, to do a study because they had a facility, as I said, in Guangdong. It was landlocked, and we asked us, the first thing was, can you just find us, a larger facility within 30 clicks of where we are now, so we can keep our labor force, and that still kept us in kind of the heart of Guangzhou. Well, we asked them, well, are you sure you want to do that? It's, you're kind of, you're not on really the cutting edge, and you have so much of your business now, not in China, but in ASEAN. Let's broaden our scope, and they certainly agreed. So we looked at then Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, and some of the things that we had to find is, this is a large investment, $50 million investment, 500,000 square feet, about 500 workers, and more importantly, or just as importantly, and we adjust this a lot, 75 engineering positions, because as you know, here in the States or anywhere, the high wage positions are really attractive to local entities based because on skill set and tax revenues and things of that nature. Anyway, Thailand had hit all the criteria that we liked. They had a great component and manufacturing base. And as I mentioned, I lived in Thailand in the early 90s before China really took off. And a lot of the stuff that's going on in China today was done in Thailand back in the early 90s. So there's a solid manufacturing and component base down there, as well as, of course, a great labor base. But also Thailand has some unique opportunities. It allows you to own your own land. They have the Treaty of Amity, which allows free flow of goods between Thailand and the USA. And as I said, because they've been very sophisticated for many years, good local experts to design and construct, to build to suit world-class manufacturing facilities. Intel, all the big Japanese electronic guys have been there for years, so a lot of good local people on the ground. But Thailand, when you work, and they have what they call the Board of Investment, and they do a really great job. They, from the government level, from the central government level, from the Bangkok level, they pick winners. Whether it's aerospace, whether it's electronics, whether it's electric vehicles, then they incentivize companies to come there and invest to the areas that they want to have come to Thailand. So in the case of with the Thai Board of Investment, and who we've got to know quite well over the last 10 or so years, Again, R&D centers. R&D centers mean engineers. Engineers mean high-paying jobs. Engineers meaning going to the good universities like Chulalongkorn and Thammasat to hire these people. And then they also wanted the Internet of Things. You want products that are connected to the web, and they were willing to pay for those. Well, at the time, our client didn't have any interest in opening up a design center, and they weren't going to bring their latest state-of-the-art appliance products that were connected to the web. Well, after we sat down with both them and the Board of Investment and negotiated, it became clear that Thailand was willing to pay for those kind of companies if they would bring R&D centers, if they would bring internet connected products. So what happened is we decided we agreed to set up their second design center outside the United States and to bring their first tier products, their latest products, which is a lot of us who've been around this business for a long time have known. Early years you'd go overseas and take your old generation and then sell the new stuff in the States. And a lot of us have been around a long time know that model doesn't work anymore. So what did Thailand do? Once we all agreed, they said, okay, you come here, we'll give you 10 years corporate tax holiday, meaning zero tax for corporate tax paid to the government of Thailand for 10 years. And after that, for 5 more years, you only have to pay half 50% tax. And doing our pro formas of what it would have been if we'd have stayed in China or other countries, it was a winner. So what happened is our client, we purchased 40 acres. East West was asked to project manage it. We helped with the design and construction of a new manufacturing facility, bringing in the general contractors, bringing in engineering and design firms. And product, 80% of it stays in ASEAN, about 5 to 10 goes back to China, and then the balance goes down to Australia. So all in all, it's a really good project.
Before we move on, a couple questions here that popped up. Can you talk more about this question was kind of comparing within Southeast Asia and China, the productivity levels of the employees, China versus Southeast Asia versus Thailand.
So yeah, we'll talk. So if you take Malaysia, Thailand, those two, they would be on par with productivity in China. If you take the Philippines and Vietnam, that would be less. So it would be less because how they compensate for that is lower labor costs. But they're not up the R&D curve as far as Thailand and Malaysia. And as I said, we joke around here. We say, Thailand was China before China was China. So very much on a par. And also what's really happened. So in the early years, when all the business was sucked out of Malaysia and Thailand into China back in the early 90s, mid 90s, labor rates in China were half of those that in Malaysia and in Thailand. Fast forward 25, 30, 35 years, Thailand right now, labor rates are half of China. When I'm talking about manufacturing, manufacturing wage. And then Vietnam would be half or thereabouts, so a little bit more than half of what Thailand is. So the whole thing is flipped on its head over the last 30 years.
Can you talk about the productivity level for Southeast Asia versus how that's going to compare to, say, Mexico or Poland, Czech Republic?
Well, and again, I'll let Dan kind of handle the Mexico piece a little bit more, but Poland and Czech Republic is, the productivity is pretty good. I mean, they've been building stuff for a long time. And as I said, with the auto industry being strong in Hungary and in Czech Republic and in Poland, they've brought a lot of technology and efficiencies in there the last 10, 15 years. So, I mean, China's still China, guys. We all know that. We all know what tens of billions of dollars of infrastructure have done for China with ports and airports and all the Western companies bringing technology there. What's that's done, right? But now you look at the wage rates and the other things, and there's other areas that maybe aren't as good as maybe on productivity, but are better on consumption, better on markets to go to, ease of doing business, no tariffs, and in some case, Thailand certainly, and Poland we found the same thing. Czech Republic, your IP is much more protected. You don't have to worry about the government of where you're dealing with. In case I use Thailand as an example, the Thais aren't trying to put their guys in business to compete against you. And other countries sometimes do that. China.
Yeah. Just another comment on labor productivity. You mentioned Mexico. Is on a wage rate standpoint, Mexico and the developed parts of the eastern part of China, very similar, although there's been very steep moves in the Mexico minimum wage in the last 2 years. Then it's expected to continue for another year or two anyway. But sort of equivalent. From a productivity standpoint, typically when we talk to people, what they see is a learning curve that a new operation, when they've expanded into Mexico, a new operation will take some period of time to come up the learning curve on productivity. And depending on the complexity of the operation, the factories will get to a equivalency in 18 to 24 months. So it's not a turn the switch and you're up and running. It takes some time, but eventually, as you work towards it, the productivity becomes on par with anywhere else in the world. But again, as in a new operation, it's going to take a year and a half or two to get there.
Yeah, just to put a tap on that, it's the relationships. Poland, of course, Thailand, but in Mexico, you develop the relationships with your potential new suppliers, and that's critical down there because they're getting so many emails that just come over the transom and say quote this, quote that, and that doesn't work. You gotta get down there. You gotta develop the relationships. You just can't waltz in there and say build this. In China, you can do that because they've had 30, 40 years now. But as Dan said, you have to work with them to get them up that learning curve of the 18 to 24 months.
Look, we had a question on this one. The question was on hiring personnel. It says in this case it was Thailand. The previous one was Poland. The previous one for that was Mexico. And they're asking about, do they have to do background checks on employees in those markets? And I think they're obviously from the question they're doing that in China. Do they do the same thing in those markets?
Yeah, and let me handle kind of the ASEAN piece a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of basic business. You want to do some background checks on your employees, maybe more so than you have to in the States. But but also you can't really stop there. And this is Thailand as well as China, certainly, and Vietnam is. You have to, on your suppliers and their ownership and the cross ownership of different suppliers. Who owns what companies? Are you dealing with 3 entities? Or are you dealing with one entity with 3 factories, right? So China's become really kind of professional at that. But to be quite frank, Thailand and Vietnam has had some of those concerns where you need to really understand the entities and the cross ownerships and then understand on your employees, frankly, as you do the checks on your employees and you look at their family members and you look at, in case we do it a lot, as you know, in China with the hokus, and where do their names appear on other companies in the region to make sure you're not buying from a company that's owned by one of your employees, and that can happen. That's happened in Thailand, and it's happened for China for sure, and in Vietnam as well. So you have to really, and that stuff you typically don't have to look at in the States as much.
You would have to do that in Poland, Czech Republic as well.
Yeah, I think again, that's good basic business. I don't think they're quite as sophisticated yet on cross ownership, but certainly where you have to be careful is in the case of Central Eastern Europe, the background and check on some of these people, and there's criminal record. We all know a little bit about Central Europe and some of the stuff coming out of the old USSR. Got to look for criminal records, things of that nature. Yeah.
The next question popped up here on the last 2. They were talking about building up supply chain, building up operations. Can you talk about some of the costs? This person mentioned the costs associated with them developing new suppliers in Vietnam and Thailand. And what are some of the hidden costs or internal costs you've got to cover?
Yeah. Well, let me take the first whack at it, and Dan can. It's are you committed to it? Do you have the internal infrastructure to to have the case of Thailand and developing a source of supply. Are you ready to go 6, 8, 10 times in a year? Are you ready to be shipping components back and forth, get your RFQs put together, do all your testing? I mean, it's a commitment, and it has to come either from your Asian operations where you have people, if you do, and if not, it has to come from headquarters, and you have to be committed to it, because otherwise, it's again, you just can't drop a part off and say build it. It just doesn't work that way. You have to have the resources internally to manage it, and then there's the cost of inventory we've talked about already. And if you can, certainly in Thailand, in Poland, and in Czech Republic, you get really close to the local economic boards. Again, Thai Board of Investment, Czech Invest, Polish Invest, and work with them and see if they have also other component suppliers that are supported by the government that they can introduce you to and help support. So, but a lot of manpower, time, and efforts you have to plan for.
Yeah, the question popped up here around ASEAN. I guess talking about on the Thailand scenario, and around for companies who are sourcing product from China, sourcing product from China, bringing it back to North America. I'm looking at this question. They wanted to know the potential of ASEAN to replicate what they're doing in China. It looks like they're primarily in the electronic sector and the fabrication business. So can you talk about ASEAN as a source of supply for electronics and fabrication, and from a company that's sourcing out of China?
Everything, quite frankly, everything that you can find in China, you'll find in ASEAN. You may have to, in Malaysia, up north, up north in Penang area, has been strong with the Japanese electronics industry for 40 years, right? In Penang, down south, of course, along the Joko Peninsula, very strong. As I said, Thailand was in the electronic, Panasonic, LG, all the guy, Intel, all those guys have been there, AMD, 30, 40 years. So no issue with that at all.
And Dan, would you add anything to that?
Well established in certainly electronics sector. If you're looking at metal work, metal fabrication, well established. And Mark mentioned Thailand, but where you've in developing in Vietnam, where you've had an automotive industry, where you've had a appliance industry, that's all well established now. Yeah.
Yep. I had a follow-up question there about sourcing out of Asia rather than sourcing out of China. What's the duty structure for Vietnam and Thailand to the U.S.?
So, I got 2 projects going there right now. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Thailand is it's a treaty of amity. So this is a treaty that goes back 150 years, I think, to Teddy Roosevelt, actually. So there are no duties, and it just can't be changed. You can't have an edict that all of a sudden says we're going to put duties on you now because we don't like you, right? So you're secure in that respect. In the case of Vietnam, if your content is over 60% Vietnamese content, then coming back to the States is zero duties.
Okay, so that's why that explains why a lot of Vietnamese sourcing out of China and then adding their own value to it, trying to get to that 60%.
Yeah, so here's what goes on a lot, guys, and just so we all know. So you have great suppliers, for example, in Guangdong province, right? But you're a little tired of China because of potential geopolitical issues and because of tariff issues, right? 25%, in case of the many products. So Vietnam has said, but you can't play the game, and people have gotten caught. You can't pass stuff just through Vietnam and say it's Vietnam now, and you'll get caught and then you get fined. So you have to really set up a business, and then you have to do your cost accounting and how much labor is in Vietnam, how much other components are in Vietnam, how much product are you bringing in from China. Add all that up, you put a margin on down there, and if you're over 60%, then you're good to go for back to the States at the preferential duties.
And so is that, go ahead, Dan, were you gonna add anything to that?
No, that pretty much covers it. Yeah.
Okay. The, moving on to the additional questions we had put on the invite, but, before we get to that, we got, one question popped up. Can you purchase land in Vietnam and Thailand?
Yes and no. Thailand, yes. Vietnam, no.
All right, Dan, got a question popped up around Mexico. From your particular discussion around, can you talk about what industry, Dan, are promising? So the customer registrant didn't list what industry they're in, but what industries are promising in Mexico? Obviously, the automotive, medical, and fabric. Are there certain industries that are more promising, say, in the last 4, 5, 6 years in Mexico?
We see a lot of growth around, we talked about metal fabrication, casting, stamping, metalworking. That's strong growth. And whether that's industrial applications or consumer applications, both are well established and growing. Electronic manufacturing services, particularly around electrical, mechanical assembly, box build, could be industrial equipment, could be consumer products. Strong growth in the last several years there. Growth in the automotive industry, certainly, and auto supply. And that's being driven by more manufacturers building in Mexico for North America, but also recently an influx of Asian automotive component manufacturers, particularly Chinese, coming into Mexico and building up that sector. Textiles, cut and sew operations are still solid there, although not so much of the raw fabric is produced there, but certainly textiles. And then growth in the furniture industry as well, which has long been established, but it's coming back. It's coming back to a large extent in the last couple of years in Mexico.
Well, it kind of leads to a follow-up question there, but Mark talked earlier about Vietnam and Thailand offering good incentives. What are the possible incentives for those who are looking at Mexico versus like a Thailand? Does Mexico offer the same thing that Poland was doing, the same thing that Southeast Asia is doing, as far as incentivizing you to manufacture there?
There are incentives, but it's not nearly as transparent as some other parts of the world, and they're very local and regionally based. You're negotiating with a state government rather than a national entity, and there's a fair amount of local guidance there. The things you see more common are training incentives and training subsidies, sometimes payroll tax incentives, occasionally subsidizing utility connection fees and utility connections for a new factory, but much more limited incentives than you see in some parts of the world. It's a bit of a rush to get there as far as snapping up industrial property. So it's really a seller's market for those services there.
So it's not the same as like in China where you have the business parks. It's very defined.
No, there are established industrial zones certainly, but those are quite popular. And that's sort of one of the sort of difficulties or surprises. I think we see people that have been established in China for several years. And when they were used to going there to be established parks and infrastructure, not just land, but utility services in place to support manufacturing companies. And although that is available in Mexico, there's much more raw undeveloped land coming onto the market that requires much more investment in time and capital to get set up as a manufacturing site. And that's a bit of a shock to some people coming into the market.
Right. Look, for everyone on all the registrants, it is now 12 o'clock. So I know we had agreed to a hard stop at 12 o'clock. We still have some more questions that have come in. So I'm going to keep asking the speakers to ask if they can stay on and continue to answer them. However, it's 12 o'clock, so the webinar officially ends, but you feel free to stay on and we will continue to answer questions as they come in. But it is 12 o'clock, so if you need to go. The next question was on this company didn't identify what type of industry they're saying, but the point was if the Mexican supply chain, right, they're trying to develop a supply chain in Mexico, has years ago there was a big worry about people moving all manufacturing down to Mexico, right, out of the U.S. Have we got some experience? Are companies still looking to do that, or are they, if they're trying to service the U.S. market, are they moving to Mexico for supply chain and manufacturing, or are they trying to kind of put a combination together of both? And Dan, I'll turn that question to you.
Companies, U.S. company, if I understand correctly, it's around U.S. companies that are looking to move manufacturing from domestic to Mexico.
The question is like, are they doing that? And if they are, what would be the reason they would do it, or the reasons?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons it would be that we see, and we hear people talk about it and pursue. Around labor availability and labor cost. The cost piece of it gets most press, but the labor availability is becoming at least as big an issue for established manufacturers. And so that's a larger. So if you're in a business that has a high labor component, it could very often make sense to make that move. The other factor that's interesting that we see is that one of the things that enters into the analysis is the age of your facility. For example, your factory in the U.S. And we've talked with folks that we're operating a factory that had been there for decades, and they were faced with decisions around capital reinvestment, major capital reinvestment in their existing facility, or making a move to a new site. And if that's the case, then that can make a move to Mexico attractive. What isn't very attractive is the thought of relocating and the cost of relocating a large amount of equipment from an existing factory and going south. Those costs are extremely expensive, and we found it very difficult to justify on just labor savings.
Okay, that makes very. Can you talk a little bit about, as far as question popped up was for the cultural differences? If you've been operating in Mexico and you're now dealing with with Chinese suppliers, you're now dealing with Mexican suppliers or Thai suppliers. You talked a little bit about the cultural side, but as far as productivity for Chinese suppliers versus Mexican suppliers, that seems to be, the question was, is that pretty comparable between Mexican suppliers and Chinese suppliers?
It's a very different situation, and I wouldn't necessarily call it productivity. There's a few other key things that we see come up. One is Mexican suppliers, many of the smaller to medium-sized suppliers that most of our clients would be looking to deal with. Capital is pretty tight. They tend to be family operations, and they tend to be somewhat undercapitalized. And so if when they're faced with needing to expand to supply a new significant customer, you get into discussions about how to finance that expansion, that more so than you would see with a supplier in China, for example. So the idea of co-financing or supporting that expansion as a customer of the new suppliers, it comes up, and more so than you'd expect to see in China, certainly. The other aspect is many companies we talk to, they're buying a product, again, sourcing out of China. They may not know all the details of the manufacturing process and the specifications, or how that product's been developed. Chinese suppliers are quite good at reverse engineering and developing their own supplier ecosystem. And when it comes time to transfer that technology into in a new geography such as Mexico, then it requires much more work to develop the specifications and the techniques than you might expect. So that tends to slow the transition process down, and creates a requirement for some technical skills within your company to help that transition.
That makes sense. There were two final questions popped up. One is, I'm assuming it says, is nearshoring growing as it pertains to U.S. consumption? I guess what they're saying is, are companies coming back to Mexico from China really to service the U.S. and North American markets? I think you, Mark, have touched on that.
Yeah, primarily. There was a lot of press in the last week about a Kearney report on nearshoring that came out. It's been referenced in the press, and there's a good discussion of it in that.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was
I'm
sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say if you get a chance, The Economist has had some good statistics on that. So, if you look at once China, you take away why you went there to begin with, which was really, really competitive costs, and that in some cases goes away because of labor or because of tariffs, then location becomes really important as it pertains to the U.S. and Mexico, of course, is because of the free trade is positioned quite well for sure.
And final question popped up is, and I guess this is for each of you, one's on Mexico and the same question on Mexico and Eastern Europe. Can you address the question of safety for Americans traveling, the reasons in Mexico and Eastern Europe? And the person is, that doesn't say what industry sector, but they're vice president of supply chain and procurement. So I guess they're looking the safety of having this person or their other colleagues going over there for supplier audits, supplier identification, supplier transition work.
Well, I'll just go ahead and make it kind of quickly, and then Dan can talk about. We have, again, Southeast Asia, and I speak a lot about Thailand and Vietnam. Obviously, it's you don't want to go to bad areas or anything, but generally speaking, safety issues. And if you look at the corruption index, there's corruption, of course. Corruption at the ports sometimes. There's corruption at the government level. Sometimes corruption at the local level. But as far as safety, my experience and our experience has been Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia has been really good, and our recent projects that we've done in Czech Republic and Poland as well. I think there's, again, from a safety standpoint, we haven't had any real issues. Again, there's always potential for corruption when it comes to either at the government level or at the local level, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
Dan, you want to add to that, or have any comments on Mexico?
Well, I think there's well-documented concerns around certain parts of Mexico. By and large, it's the country's safe and secure to navigate. And one of the positives is the information is well published, and it's easy to find out between the State Department and the press. But the other thing is we tend to, because we deal with U.S. companies that are sensitive to this, we tend to gravitate towards suppliers and sites in areas that have proven to be secure and quiet, safe, and livable for a number of reasons.
Excellent. All right. Well, look, it's about 10 minutes after 12. That concludes concludes the webinar. First, Mark and Dan, thank you all for speaking, and thank you for staying on additional 10 minutes to answer the follow-up questions. I just wanted to appreciate you all signing up, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact East West. Will be sent a webinar survey, and please feel free to fill that out. Also, our webinar will be recorded, and the PowerPoint will be put up on our website at East West Associates. And please feel free to ask any questions. If you need us, you can contact us from our own website. You can reach out to us. Again, this concludes this webinar. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.